Okay.
All right. So I'm Chris Sturr. I'm co-editor of Dollars and Cents Magazine, and I'm here with Marie Christine Duggan, who's a professor of business management at Keene State College in Keene, New Hampshire, and she is a PhD economist. And for our July-August 2021 issue, she wrote a piece about Boeing, the title of which was provocatively Boeing hijacked by shareholders and execs. How Boeing workers are battling against perverse incentives, what their story tells us about our financialized economy. So, in light of the recent incident with the Alaska Air Boeing, it was a Boeing 737 MAX in which, terrifyingly, one of this emergency exit door blew off in mid-flight, and they had to do an emergency landing. And although incredibly no one was hurt, Boeing has been up for a lot of criticism. And it's revived these concerns about the safety of Boeing airplanes. So, since that was the focus of Marie's article, and how as she seeks to explain, why Boeing has these safety problems and and she tells this story about how it's related to our larger economic trends. I wanted to interview her, revisit her article and interview her about it. So welcome, Marie.
Thank you, Chris. It's
Yeah.
nice to be
So
with you.
yeah. So why don't you start just by telling us how you learned what you know about Boeing?
Well, I had become interested in the industrial base here in Keene, New Hampshire, in Cheshire County. And there were a couple of firms here that were very well run that are produce parts for Boeing
Mhm.
or produce machines that Boeing uses. GE Aviation is in Hooksett, New Hampshire, and they make the LEAP engines that go on Boeing planes. And Avtech here in Cheshire County makes ultra precision technology that GE Aviation uses in its production process. And then a high tech machine shop, GS Precision,
Mhm.
makes parts for airplane companies, which I presume the United States would be Boeing. So these companies are well managed, and offer good life prospects for people and training. So Boeing is the larger entity. And so I started to track annual reports for Boeing.
Mhm.
And what I do is I'm a little bit of a nerdy type, and I go online and I find the annual reports and I download the annual reports. Now, some people have access to fancy databases, but I don't because I teach at a small state college. So I go to the original annual reports and I print them out and I create spreadsheets and I track what are the sources of the company's funds and how does it use the funds.
Mhm.
And I look at its relationship with its workers. Boeing had a bid strike in 2008 of its machinists, and there was a point where its engineers also went on strike.
Mhm.
So, and you could see the changes in the management as well. And so I look at the numbers to see what they tell us. And the story they tell us, this isn't the only company I've looked at. I've looked at a number of companies that are publicly held that are important to Keene's industrial base.
Mhm.
And what I found is the same everywhere, which is that 20 years ago, these businesses invested a lot in equipment. And over time, they invest less and less in equipment. And that's a little scary because we're supposed to be living in capitalism. And you think that the biggest corporations will be accumulating capital. And by that, we don't just mean money.
Mhm.
Capitalism, the term capital is different from money. It's supposed to involve accumulating highly productive technology that you can use to make precision stuff.
Mhm.
And that's what they sort of stopped doing.
All right. So you looked at the sources of funds and how they deployed them, and saw these changes. And so I want to talk about the the part of your subtitle that talks about our financialized economy. So we hear economists and commentators talk about financialization, but can you just explain that and how it relates to how Boeing spends its money? And then bring us back to how that relates to these safety problems.
Yes. Okay. So the quote from my article that a lot of people are picking up is that in 2017,
Uh-huh.
The company spent 66% of its free cash flow on stock buybacks or dividends, which are both type flows of money that are going to make shareholders rich.
Right.
And it only spent 9% of its free cash flow on capital equipment. And the capital equipment is what allows it to make good planes.
Mm-hmm.
So the fact that it spent it's really quite a bit more on the shareholders than it did on the capital equipment was a bit of a shock. And back around 2000, it wouldn't have been that way. Back around 2000, they would have spent most of their free cash flow on equipment and a small percentage going to the shareholders. It would have been really reversed.
So why
Maybe
this?
9%
Why
would
this
have gone to
shift?
the shareholders, 66% would have gone into capital equipment back in the year 2000.
Right. So what explains that shift? What are the new incentives that are leading them to spend on?
So in 1982, and this is something Bill Lazonick talks about, in 1982, it became legal for companies to buy back shares of their own stock.
Right.
So what's happened, and then also top executives get paid with stock options, meaning that if the executive can make the stock price go up, he will personally earn millions. In fact, most of their pay now comes from that.
Right.
So they have a lot of incentive to make the stock price go up. And I think we all thought, well, the way a company would make a stock price go up would be to make a better quality product. But that turns out to be the hard and expensive way to make your stock price go up. And the cheap and dirty way to make your stock price go up, if you have a really big company, is just to take its gazillions of dollars and buy shares of your own stock.
Got it.
If you go out and buy your own stock, if you are a big enough company, you can make the stock price rise just like that. And so that's what these people started to do. So it started to be that Boeing produced a share price that would rise. It stopped seeing itself, I think, its management. I mean, it never said this, but from its actions, and you say actions speak louder than words, the management began to see their top job as making the stock price rise. And profits from selling airplanes were a means to make the stock price rise. And producing high quality planes was not the top focus of this management.
Right. Yeah. So, and this is this, I mean, one of the things that you hit home on in your article is that this is happening throughout the economy. This is not just Boeing. It's all over the economy. So the Boeing story is kind of an object lesson about the effects of financialization on the economy. And maybe you can
Yes,
just
that's right.
yeah.
I mean, I guess I'd like to just clarify though that at smaller firms, which are not publicly held, the incentives are still the opposite. These small firms like GS Precision or Abtech here in Keene, which are not the same. GS Precision produces parts, and Abtech is an ultra precision maker of machines. But they both face intense competition. And my guess is that their managers and owners invest a lot into equipment and people. And I've talked to them about it, and they say that their top goal is to hire the best people and to compensate them and persuade them to move to New Hampshire. So I think that's a really important thing, a distinction to make between the small privately owned companies and the very large publicly held corporations. And private equity is really the same as the publicly held corporations. They're trying to make shareholders rich and not really to invest in their incentive isn't so much to make a high quality product as it is to make the shareholders rich.
Right.
Now, one of the things that is very important then is that Boeing doesn't have any competition in the United States. Its only competition in the world is Airbus, which is a European producer. Many people say that the competition with Airbus drove Boeing to do this. It's actually, I would say, precisely the opposite. The fact that within the United States, there is no competition for Boeing, and there is pressure from, there is pressure from politicians that American Airlines should purchase planes made in the United States. And honestly, under normal circumstances, I would completely agree with that. I would also like to see the US industrial base really solid. But without competition, there was nothing holding Boeing back from making shoddier and shoddier planes.
Right.
And that is increasingly a situation that many US corporations face. They buy out the competition, and then there's nothing to force them to produce a quality product.
Right.
I think of my refrigerator, where I purchased a refrigerator. It was a Frigidaire, and it had a nice energy efficiency rating. But within 1 year of my buying it, the seal around the door no longer worked. So it can't possibly be energy efficient if the seal around the door doesn't work. And it's remarkable that they would try to sell those. But there wasn't a whole lot of competition. There weren't that many other options for me to buy, and the other options weren't that much better.
Right. So one of the subtitles of your article is a share price impervious to disaster or something like that. So, it's too bad if your refrigerator isn't energy efficient, but it can be absolutely deadly and disastrous if the quality of planes, right, declines. And there have been some serious accidents with Boeing planes, yet it hasn't necessarily, hurt their share price. Why is that?
It was shocking to me that the only thing that seriously knocked Boeing's share price down was the COVID pandemic. So it is shocking to me that the COVID pandemic had a greater impact on Boeing's share price than the crash of the two 737 Maxes in 2018 and 2019. Because really, these two planes malfunction for exactly the same reason. So when that happens, they said it was a design issue. I mean, those planes crashed. So the conventional wisdom now is that those planes crashed because there was a faulty software which overrode the pilot's decisions and pushed the nose down. And certainly having software that can override the pilot's decisions is bad. But the reason that the software kicked in was because there was a piece of equipment on the wings that was supposed to send a message to the software that the plane, was going nose up, and it was supposed to push the nose back down. So this piece of equipment on the wing is actually what malfunctioned. And one former employee of Boeing, who's spoken out, about problems with the company's management is Ed Pearson, and he really raised that. He said, why is it that on brand new Boeing planes, there were parts that were giving a false signal to the software? And I think that's a really good point, that it's not just the software. Having software kick in to override your pilots that the pilots cannot get rid of is a huge problem.
Right.
But in addition, it is shocking that this piece of equipment on brand new Boeing planes was malfunctioning. And the reason Ed Pearson points to that is because he's saying that, the production process itself does not have integrity.
Mhm.
And that's a larger problem.
Right. So this actually reminds me that I wanted to ask you about the workers' voices that you bring into the article. You said that when you started doing research on Boeing, you found that there was plenty of testimony to be found out there from workers who were engineers and so on at Boeing who were raising alarm bells about how these changes in management were affecting their jobs and hence the safety of the products that they could produce. And so maybe you could talk a little bit about the evidence that you found from workers.
Yes. So, I, being somewhat nerdy, started with the numbers and the Boeing annual reports and rather painstakingly put each number in to find the sources of funds and how the money was spent for 20 years. But then I wanted to find the human side of the stories. So when I saw, say, a turning point, like 2008 was a big turning point, then I wanted to look in and see more about the machinist strike.
Mm-hmm.
And when I started looking to see what workers at Boeing had said, it's all over the internet and all over the databases, because so many workers of Boeing have done their best to try to keep the quality. They've put their lives on the line. I mean, I guess they're not risking their life, but they were,
livelihoods. Yeah.
one fellow who spoke out, he lost his job. He was a quality inspector, and it was just time for his kids to go to college. So and he couldn't afford to make his house payments. So that was devastating. And Gerald Eastman, in 2003, he was an quality inspector who'd gone to the Seattle Times. There's a reporter there, Dominic Gates, who's held Boeing accountable for a long time. And when Gerald Eastman spoke out, Boeing pressed charges against him. And he said he was doing the right thing to protect passengers by bringing to light the shoddy quality control. Mm-hmm. And the police said, well, if that quality control is so shoddy, how come Boeing planes aren't falling out of the sky? And the thing is, they did fall out of the sky in 2018 and 2019, but he was first speaking out in 2003, because that's when the process started to get corrupted. But there were so many people inside Boeing that did want to keep the quality up, that even when the management started to behave strangely, it didn't immediately result in bad things. But over time, the top employees retire. And when Boeing went to hire new employees, it didn't give them proper training. Right. And it kept paying people less and less. In 2008, they removed the defined benefit pension plan from their machinists, while at the same time giving their executives incredible perks. And one of the more recent strikes was in South Carolina. Boeing built a second. So Washington State had been the base for Boeing production for decades. And there were machinists, the top aerospace machinists in the world lived in Washington State. And, when you learn to be a machinist, if you have a parent that's a machinist that can show you things at home, it really helps. Because a lot of this is personal transmission of knowledge. So those were really the best machinists in the world. But Boeing decided that they wanted these machinists in Washington State to accept massive cuts to their pay and benefits. So they built an identical second plant in South Carolina where they hired non-union machinists. And Al Jazeera did an expose where you can see that the conditions inside the plant were not good, and the morale was not good, and the training was not good, and shoddy things were happening. And I believe Qatar Airways was going to purchase Boeing planes, and they insisted that they didn't want them from the South Carolina plant.
Wow.
Of course, over time, I think the South Carolina people did get to be better machinists, but they never had the same training as the people in Washington State. And as they got better, they wanted better compensation too. So there was a group of just 200 mechanics, I think, who were inspecting Boeing planes in South Carolina, just this tiny group of 200 who went on strike to get, what they were complaining about was they had no control. They had to do mandatory overtime. What happens with mandatory overtime is people just get tired. It's like working 7 days a week, six weeks in a row, and you just get tired. Ed Pearson mentioned this too as something that was happening in Renton, where people were starting to make mistakes just because they were exhausted. And in South Carolina, they wanted to get a union which would put some rules in place. So they said, like, and they had, this is stuff I learned from the internet, because they have put up videos talking about how they would be working at 9 o'clock on Friday and thinking they were about to end the workday, and they would get news at that point, 9 p.m. on a Friday, that actually you need to stay till midnight. And so they thought if they had a union, they could at least put some structure into the overtime, and you wouldn't just be sitting there at 9 p.m. And one guy mentions that his 15-year-old daughter had died, and the day she died, he was working. And it just brings home, I mean, obviously that's a tragic story, but it also brings home what I know as a parent too, that you can't work all the time and also raise children. You need to be home. And this is what was disappearing. So we can say that's really unfair, and we can all see the unfairness of it. But I think what we're beginning to see with the crashes is that the lousy conditions where the planes are built translate into unsafe planes for the passengers.
Yeah, I mean, this is one of the things that we were talking about before we started the interview, that you think that one of the things that's important about your work is that when people talk about the growth of inequality under neoliberalism, they hammer home, rightly so, about how unfair it is for workers and how they're not paid as much, but that you're shining a spotlight on this other effect of inequality and of financialization, that it's making that it's chipping away at the quality of what's produced.
That's right. The product quality is going down.
Yeah.
And you see that with hospitals too.
Oh yeah.
When hospitals give nurses abusive working conditions, too many patients for one nurse, the nurse's life becomes very difficult. She cries every day on the way home because she's not been able to prevent various things from happening to the patients. But obviously, the quality of care for the patient has also gone down.
Yeah.
I mean, we all know that there are certain conditions where you can't even speak and you're in the hospital, and the nurse's ability to pay attention is key.
Right.
And we see that with education too, where teachers are paid so little they're forced to have two jobs, and then there are no books for the kids to learn from, so everything is online, and it just is not the same quality of education. And we actually know that. Like, we know kids are not learning to read the way they used to, and we know they're not learning cursive. They can't read their relatives' letters. When people say, well, it doesn't matter, because the modern world, you don't have to read and you don't have to do cursive.
Yeah.
That's actually not true. Like, you do need those things, but you need, we also do, we listen to podcasts and we watch videos, but you do still need to read and to write to other people.
Mhm.
So that kind of fakeness that, there's a lot of talk of technological innovation. Like at one point, Boeing installed quite a few robots in its factories to build planes. And then it turned out that actually some of the things that the robot were supposed to do was not something that a robot could do, that you needed the most flexible, which is the human mind and the human hands, to do those procedures. So when we talk about innovation, I mean, for me as an economist, I would say innovation is a better quality product at a lower price. So if you replace, human beings' flexible hands and minds with a robot that can't really do the task, that isn't innovation. That's just cheap.
Right. So yeah, and the list of industries that are being affected by some of the trends that you talk about just goes on and on. I mean, when you talk about healthcare, then private equity is taking over healthcare systems, and
they're shifting a larger percentage to the shareholders.
right.
In that case, with private equity, you don't get an annual report, right? Because it's private equity, they're not required to publish how they're spending their money. So they're probably extracting even greater amounts for shareholders and investing even less into capital equipment and the workforce. But I don't have the data to prove that, because
Right.
businesses, once purchased by private equity, don't have to leave a paper trail. Whereas Boeing is a publicly held corporation, which is required to issue annual reports.
Mhm.
Now, one thing that is worth mentioning is that, what this means, if the largest corporations in America are not investing in capital equipment, is that US productivity is probably going to go down, because so productivity is efficiency, like how much you produce in an hour.
Mhm.
So it's not how much you produce overall, it's how much you produce in a unit of time. So usually having a great tool to work with is what makes your productivity go up.
Right.
Like if you're using an automated shovel, it's different than using a hand shovel, right? But if Boeing is spending less and less on excellent equipment, then you would expect the workers' productivity go down, because workers aren't going to be able to find the best equipment to use.
Mhm.
So we did see that at the US economy as a whole, in that article, that productivity in the United States, first of all, it was increasing, but increasing by less every year. And then it actually went negative,
Right.
meaning people 5 years earlier could produce more than what people were producing in 2020 in an hour on average in the United States, which was really shocking to me.
Yeah.
Now, somebody pointed out to me, I got the data from the BLS, the Bureau of Labor Statistics, that the BLS has changed its data. So if you go and download that productivity data today, it shows a decline in productivity growth, but it doesn't actually show it going negative.
Hmm.
And I think I don't know why they changed it, but my guess is that we as a society don't really want to come to the conclusion that workers today are producing less than they did 5 years ago.
Hmm.
But I think it's better we take our heads out of the sand and don't redefine how we collect productivity data, but just face the fact that our workers are not given the equipment and the conditions in which to produce their very best.
Mhm. So we should probably wrap up, but I wanted to ask, you've been following the coverage of Boeing since the Alaska Airlines incident. And I'm wondering if you could just say how you think the coverage has been. I mean, I'm really happy that a few outlets at least have been contacting you about your dollars and cents piece, but do you think they've been getting it right? And do you think that, Boeing is going to finally uh, be held accountable, and word will get out about how the management changes have compromised safety?
Well, Chris, I'm usually gloom and doom, but I actually think that there is some traction. And the new head of the Federal Aviation Administration, Whitaker, has actually said that these 737 MAX 9s cannot go back in the air until they're thoroughly inspected. And he seems to have, he seems to mean it.
Mhm.
The Lever is putting a lot of pressure with their coverage. They found an employee at Spirit Aerosystems in Wichita, Kansas, Joshua Dean, had, again, this is an employee trying to protect integrity of production. He had filed some document stating that so many errors were occurring at the plant that a serious incident was bound to result.
Mm.
Um, Now, I would like to see the New York Times pay more attention to the integrity of production. I don't think we've quite realized yet that forcing people to work mandatory overtime degrades the quality of production. If
Right.
workers are earning more, well, Boeing pays the workers too little, so they might volunteer to do overtime so that they have enough to pay the rent. But in addition, it tends to force people to do overtime.
Mhm.
And if you're having people install electronics, you really need them to be able to focus on the job. So a 40-hour work week is actually good for quality.
Mhm.
And having people earn enough so they can eat 3 meals a day and have steady housing gives people the kind of family life that when you get to work, you can really focus on work.
Mhm.
So I feel like the production process and the integrity of that process is maybe something that the FAA is more aware of as being an issue. But
Yeah.
I don't feel like the major news organizations have yet focused on the production process as being the key to customer safety.
Mhm. Well, maybe we can send them a copy of this interview and get them to take notice.
Well, dollars and cents, that's why dollars and cents is so important.
Yeah. Yeah. Um, well, maybe sometime we can have you on with Erica Wills, who wrote our May-June 2023 cover story about the aviation unions and how they're starting to raise alarm bells about stock buybacks. And so we could have you and Erica kind of compare notes about the problem. And I mean, that's evidence that it's the word is getting out to the unions at least, and they're having a public campaign about it. So,
That's
and they,
great.
yeah, they're recognizing that same connection. Anyway, well, thanks so much for taking your time to talk to us, and yeah, we appreciate it. Hopefully, we'll get some. I'm gonna repost your article at the top of the homepage, and we'll get some more attention to it.
Thank you.
All right, take care.